You ever watch someone lose control of something they thought they owned, without touching a single thing? The sound hit first, that hollow metallic clank echoing across the lake like a warning nobody understood yet, followed by the frustrated rattle of a gate that used to open with a simple code, but now just didn't. And I could smell the damp wood and algae drifting up from the shoreline below, as early morning light rolled across $12 million worth of lake houses that suddenly felt a whole lot less valuable. And I stood there with my boots still dusty from yesterday's work, coffee cooling in my hand, watching it all unfold exactly the way I knew it would. Because less than 24 hours ago, I was sitting in a perfectly air-conditioned HOA meeting room, while Deborah Whitmore smiled like she'd already won, her fingers tapping lightly against a polished oak table, as if my time didn't matter. As if the 3 days I'd spent waist-deep in freezing water stabilizing their shoreline after their contractors botched a drainage job meant nothing. And I remember sliding the invoice across to her, $63,500 in black ink. Every line item documented, every repair photographed, every hour accounted for down to the minute. The smell of lake mud still on my clothes because I'd come straight from the site. And she didn't even pick it up, just tilted her head slightly and gave me that practiced, polite smile that never reaches the eyes. The kind people use when they're about to say no before you've even finished explaining. That's not our responsibility, she said, voice smooth, almost sweet, like she was doing me a favor, and around that table heads nodded. A few quiet murmurs, people who had no idea what it took to keep that shoreline from collapsing into the water they loved to look at. People who thought a lake maintained itself. And I felt the grit still stuck under my fingernails, the ache in my shoulders from hauling materials, the weight of every hour I'd already given them. And I realized something in that moment. Not anger, not frustration, just clarity, because this wasn't about the money to them. It was about control, about deciding what counted and what didn't, about assuming the guy who actually did the work didn't have the leverage to push back. And that's when I stopped talking, just nodded once, folded the invoice back into my folder, and walked out without another word. The door clicking shut behind me louder than it should have, and the second I stepped outside the air felt different, cooler, sharper, like the decision had already been made somewhere deep in my gut before I even processed it, and I drove straight back to the lake. Gravel crunching under my tires. That familiar sound grounding me as I parked near the access gate most of those homeowners didn't even realize existed. The one tucked behind a line of old cedar posts that had been there longer than any of those houses. And I ran my hand along the cold metal chain, feeling the worn grooves where the lock had been opened and closed thousands of times. Thinking about the original deed my grandfather used to keep in a locked drawer, the one he'd shown me years ago. When I was just a kid asking too many questions, and I could almost hear his voice telling me, pay attention to the details nobody else reads. And that night, I did exactly that. I went home, pulled out every document I had, every survey, every amendment, every line of fine print most people would skip, and somewhere between a faded signature and a paragraph that looked like boilerplate, I found it. One sentence that changed everything. One sentence that meant the lake they bragged about, the docks they built, the access they advertised, all ran through something they didn't actually own. And I remember sitting there in the quiet, the hum of the overhead light the only sound in the room, reading that line over and over until it stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like a plan. And by the time the sun went down, I wasn't thinking about the $63,500 anymore. I was thinking about leverage, about access, about the one thing they assumed would always be there no matter. How they treated the people who kept it running. And as I stood there the next morning listening to that gate refuse to open for the third time in a row, watching Deborah's white SUV pull up faster than usual, her door swinging open with more force than she probably intended, I took a slow sip of coffee and finally allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Because they hadn't just refused to pay my bill, they'd handed me something far more valuable. and they were about to learn exactly what it costs to lose access to something you never truly owned in the first place. Deborah's heels clicked sharp against the concrete as she marched toward that gate like it had personally insulted her. The early morning air still carrying that faint mix of lake water and treated wood, and I could hear the keypad beeping over and over, each failed attempt just a little faster than the last, like pressing harder would somehow change the outcome. But it did not. And that was the part most people do not understand about systems like this. Once the control shifts, it does not matter how important you think you are. The mechanism either responds or it does not. And right now it did not. I stayed where I was up on the gravel ridge, boots planted, watching her try again, then again, until she finally turned and spotted me, her posture tightening, that polished confidence from yesterday's meeting cracking just enough to show something underneath. Not fear yet, but confusion. And she started walking up toward me with that same controlled pace she used in the boardroom. Like she could still manage the situation if she just said the right words. "Ethan," she called out, voice carrying across the still water. "What is going on with the gate?" And I let a second pass before answering. Just enough time for the silence to stretch, for the weight of the moment to settle in. "It is working exactly how it is supposed to," I said, taking another slow sip of coffee, and I could see the shift happen right there, her eyes narrowing slightly, recalculating, because that was not the answer she expected. She stepped closer, the gravel crunching under her shoes, that sound echoing in the quiet morning like a metronome counting down something she could not yet see. "Residents cannot access their docks," she said, emphasizing each word like it carried authority on its own. And I nodded once, calm, steady. "I am aware," I replied, and behind her a couple of homeowners had started to gather, standing near their boats, arms crossed, phones already out, that low murmur of confusion building into something louder, the kind of sound that spreads quickly in places like this, where convenience is expected and interruption feels personal. Deborah glanced back at them, then back at me. And for the first time since I had known her, she looked like she was choosing her next move instead of delivering it. "This needs to be fixed immediately," she said, tone sharpening just a fraction. And there it was, the assumption still hanging in the air, that I was there to respond, to solve, to comply. And I set the coffee cup down on the hood of my truck, wiped my hands slowly on a rag, buying myself a few extra seconds, not because I needed them, but because timing matters. "Nothing is broken," I said, meeting her gaze directly now. "Access has been restricted," and that word landed different. I could see it, like a switch flipping in her head. Restricted meant intentional. Restricted meant control. Restricted meant this was not a malfunction she could delegate away. And the noise behind her grew louder. Someone calling out that their boat rental schedule was being affected. Another voice asking why their code was not working. The lake's surface reflecting all of it back in that calm, almost mocking way water has. And Deborah stepped closer, lowering her voice now, trying to pull the conversation back into something private, something manageable. "You do not have the authority to do this," she said, quieter but tighter, and I almost smiled at that. Not out of arrogance, but because I had read that exact sentence in her eyes the day before when she dismissed my invoice. And I reached into my truck, pulled out a thin folder, the edges worn from being handled too many times in the last 12 hours, and held it out just enough for her to see the top page, the heading clear, the date unmistakable. "Actually," I said, voice even, "this says I do." And I did not need to explain it all right there. I did not need to walk her through every clause or signature or amendment, because the look on her face told me she understood one thing immediately. This was not a bluff. This was not a reaction. This was a position, and positions backed by documentation are not easily moved. She hesitated, just for a second, eyes flicking between the paper and the gate behind her, where another failed beep cut through the air, and that was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that the balance of control started to tilt in a direction she could not stop anymore. Deborah did not take the folder from my hand right away, and that hesitation told me more than anything she could have said, because people like her do not pause unless something underneath them just shifted, and the breeze coming off the lake carried that faint mineral smell mixed with wet wood as the morning warmed up, while behind her the noise kept building, boat engines idling, frustrated voices rising, phones ringing, all of it stacking into pressure she could not ignore, and she finally reached out, fingers stiff, and took the top page just long enough to scan it, her eyes moving faster than her breathing, searching for something she could push back against, something she could dismiss the same way she dismissed my invoice. But legal language does not bend to tone. It sits there cold and exact, and I watched her read the line that mattered, the one about exclusive control of mechanical access and shoreline infrastructure, the one that had been sitting quietly in county records for decades while newer documents piled on top of it like noise. And when she looked up again, that practiced smile was gone, replaced by something tighter, something calculating. "This is outdated," she said quickly, almost too quickly, like speed alone could weaken the paper. And I shook my head once, calm, steady. "It was never amended," I replied, and the words landed clean. No room for interpretation, just fact. And one of the homeowners stepped closer at that moment, a guy in a polo shirt, with a boat key still in his hand, his voice cutting through the tension. "Are you saying we cannot use the lake?" And I turned slightly toward him, keeping my tone even. "I am saying access is controlled, and that distinction mattered, because control is not denial. Control is leverage, and Deborah knew it. I could see it in the way she shifted her stance, angling herself between me and the residents like she could still manage the narrative. "This is a temporary issue," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, projecting confidence she did not fully have anymore. "We are handling it." And that word handling almost made me laugh. But I kept my face neutral, because the truth did not need help. It just needed time, and time was exactly what they did not have. Another boat owner called out that his weekend rental had been booked months in advance. Someone else mentioned guests arriving that afternoon. And suddenly this was not just inconvenience. It was money, reputation, expectations all colliding at once, and Deborah stepped closer to me again, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "What do you want?" she said. And there it was, not a command this time, not a dismissal, but a question, and I let a beat pass, just enough for that shift to settle in fully. "Yesterday, I wanted the invoice paid," I said quietly. "Today I want compliance." And her eyes narrowed slightly, processing, recalculating, because compliance meant terms, it meant conditions, it meant she was no longer setting the rules unchallenged, and she glanced back at the gate again, another failed beep cutting through the air like punctuation, and for the first time she did not move toward it, did not try. The code again, because she understood now that this was not about a keypad, it was about ownership, about authority, about a system she had assumed was hers without ever verifying it. And I could see the weight of that realization settling in, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to change how she stood, how she spoke, how she looked at me. And as the sun climbed a little higher, reflecting off the still water behind her, I knew this was only the surface of it, because once people realize they do not control something they built their confidence on, they do not just lose access, they start making mistakes trying to get it back. And Deborah Whitmore was not the kind of person who accepted limits quietly, which meant whatever came next was not going to be simple, but it was going to be predictable. Deborah did not argue again, not out loud, and that silence told me she had already shifted from denial to strategy, the kind that happens fast when someone realizes the ground under them is not as solid as they thought. And I could hear her phone vibrating in her hand before she even stepped away, turning slightly to the side, voice dropping just enough as she started making calls, pulling in whoever she trusted to fix problems she could not control alone, while the residents stayed clustered. Near the dock, Their conversation sharper now, more pointed, the tone shifting from confusion to frustration, and I leaned back against my truck, feeling the warm metal through my shirt as the sun climbed higher, letting the moment stretch, because pressure works best when you do not rush it. And within 15 minutes, a black sedan rolled up behind Deborah's SUV, tires crunching hard against the gravel like it was in a hurry to catch up to a situation already moving without it, and a man stepped out in a pressed shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to look practical, holding a leather folder that matched his expression, focused, slightly irritated, already behind schedule, and Deborah moved toward him quickly, speaking in low, tight sentences, pointing once toward the gate, once toward me, and I watched the shift happen again as the man walked over, slower this time, more measured, like he understood this was not something to handle casually. "Ethan Cole," he said, extending a hand that I did not immediately take, not out of disrespect, just timing. "I am Daniel Reeves, counsel for the association," and I nodded once before shaking his hand, firm, brief, the kind of handshake that ends exactly when it needs to, no more, no less. And he glanced past me toward the gate, hearing another failed attempt echo in the distance, then back to me. "Eyes sharper now. We need to resolve this quickly," he said, and I could almost hear the word quickly carrying weight from somewhere else. Calls already made, expectations already set, and I kept my voice even. "It can be resolved today," I replied, and that answer made him pause just slightly, recalibrating. Because most disputes drag, most people argue, but I was not arguing. I was offering an outcome, and outcomes come with terms. He opened his folder, flipping through documents he had likely reviewed in the car, scanning for angles, for leverage, for anything that could tilt this back in their favor. But the thing about old documents is they do not change under pressure. And after a few seconds he closed the folder. Again, slower this time, more deliberate. "You are asserting control over access based on this amendment," he said, tone neutral, professional, but I could hear the shift underneath it. Acknowledgement, and I nodded. "I am exercising it," I said, and behind him Deborah crossed her arms, not in confidence this time, but in restraint, holding herself in place while someone else handled the conversation. And the residents had gone quieter, listening now, because when lawyers show up, people understand something real is happening, and Daniel took a breath, glancing once more toward the water, the boats, the idle docks that suddenly meant nothing without access, then back to me. "What are your terms?" he asked, and there it was again, the shift confirmed. No more assumptions, no more dismissals, just negotiation, and I reached into my truck, pulled out a second folder, thicker than the first, edges straight, pages aligned, and held it out between us. "Full payment of the outstanding invoice," I said, "plus a maintenance agreement moving forward, written, enforceable, and recognized by the county." And I could see Deborah react to that. Just a flicker, but enough. Because this was no longer about one bill. It was about control going forward, about preventing this exact situation from ever happening again. And Daniel took the folder, scanning the first page, then the next, his expression tightening not from disagreement, but from understanding the scope of it. And he looked up at me after a moment. "You prepared this overnight," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and I gave a small nod. "I prepared it when I realized yesterday was not going to be enough," and the wind shifted slightly, carrying the sound of water lapping against the docks that nobody could reach. And for a moment, everything felt still again, balanced on a decision that was no longer theirs alone to make, because the difference between control and assumption had finally become visible, and there was no way to unsee it now. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that pause carried more weight than any argument could have, because it meant he was not looking for a quick way around this anymore. He was measuring it, calculating the cost of fighting versus the cost of accepting, and behind him Deborah shifted her stance again, her patience thinning as the reality of the situation settled deeper with every second that gate stayed locked. The sun now high enough to reflect off the water in sharp flashes that made everything feel brighter, harsher, more exposed. And I could hear one of the homeowners on the phone explaining to someone that the lake was temporarily inaccessible, his voice tight, embarrassed, like he did not quite believe the words himself. And that is when the pressure starts to spread, not just on the people directly involved, but outward, into schedules, into expectations, into everything that depends on something working the way it always has. Daniel finally closed the folder I had handed him, pressing the pages flat with one hand like he could somehow smooth the situation into something simpler. And he looked at Deborah, not speaking, just a glance. But it was enough, because she understood exactly what it meant. This was no longer a matter of dismissing a contractor or pushing back a bill. This was a structural problem, one that sat underneath everything they had built on top of it. And she stepped forward again, her voice lower now, controlled but strained. "This is excessive," she said, not to the residents, not to the air, but directly to me, and I tilted my head slightly, considering the word, because excessive only applies when you have options, and right now their options were narrowing by the minute. "It is complete," I replied, keeping my tone level. "There is a difference." And that distinction hung there between us, quiet but sharp, and Daniel nodded once, almost imperceptibly, like he agreed even if he did not want to say it out loud. Then he turned slightly, gesturing for Deborah to step aside with him, and they moved a few feet away, close enough that I could still see them, far enough that their voices blended into low murmurs carried off by the breeze, and I did not try to listen. I did not need to, because I already knew the conversation. I had seen versions of it before, the quick review of facts, the realization of risk, the acknowledgement that pushing back would not just delay the problem, but amplify it. And as they spoke, I glanced back toward the gate, where another homeowner had just arrived, stepping out of a truck with a look that shifted from casual to confused the moment he saw the cluster of people and the locked access point. And he walked up to the keypad, pressed the code, heard the same flat rejection, and exhaled sharply. That small sound carrying frustration that would only grow the longer this continued. And I checked my watch without thinking, not because I was in a hurry, but because time was now part of the negotiation, every minute adding weight to my position without me having to say another word. And after what felt like just long enough, Daniel and Deborah turned back toward me, their pace slower this time, more deliberate, like the decision had already been made and they were just aligning on how to present it. Daniel stepped forward first, his expression composed, professional, but different now, grounded in something more concrete than before. "We are prepared to resolve the outstanding invoice," he said, and I let that sit for a second, because words matter. Prepared is not the same as committed, and he seemed to catch that, adding quickly, in full, and I gave a small nod, acknowledging it without reacting beyond that, because this was only the first piece. Deborah crossed her arms again, but this time it looked less like control and more like containment, holding back everything she would have said yesterday, everything she could not say now. And Daniel continued, "Regarding the maintenance agreement," he said, glancing down briefly at the folder. "Before looking back up, we will need to review specific terms with the board." And there it was, the attempt to slow things down, to regain some space. But I had already anticipated that, already built for it. "The terms are standard," I said, calm, steady. "What is not standard is the current situation." And I gestured lightly toward the gate, toward the water beyond it, toward everything that had stopped working the moment control shifted, and the sound of another failed access attempt cut through the air again, louder this time, more frustrated, like even the machine was getting tired of repeating itself. And Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding once more, this time with more weight, because he understood what I was saying without needing it spelled out, that this was not a conversation that could be stretched over days or meetings or committees. This was happening now, in real time, with consequences that were already unfolding, and he adjusted his grip on the folder, looking directly at me. If we agree to the maintenance terms as presented, he said carefully, access is restored immediately. And I met his gaze, steady, unflinching. Access is restored when the agreement is signed. I replied, and for a moment everything went quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes right before a decision becomes final, because at that point there were no more misunderstandings, no more assumptions left to lean on, just a simple exchange, control for compliance, and Deborah Whitmore, who had walked into this thinking she could decide what counted and what did not, was now standing in a place where the only thing left to decide was how quickly she was willing to accept that she never had that control in the first place. Deborah did not speak right away, and that silence stretched longer this time, heavier, because now it was not just about control, it was about consequence, and I could see it settling in the way she held herself, shoulders tighter, jaw set, eyes no longer scanning for options but narrowing in on the reality. She could not talk her way around, and the wind picked up just enough to ripple the surface of the lake behind her, small waves tapping rhythmically against docks that sat unused, each soft slap against wood sounding like a reminder that time was still moving, whether she liked it or not. And Daniel shifted his weight slightly beside her, glancing once at his watch before looking back at me, not impatient, just aware, because delays now carried visible cost, and somewhere behind the line of houses a garage door opened, then another, the normal rhythm of a neighborhood trying to continue while something underneath it had already changed, and Deborah finally exhaled slowly, stepping forward again, closer this time, closing the distance like she needed to feel the conversation directly, not filtered through distance or tone. You are asking us to commit long-term based on a single incident, she said, voice steady but thinner than before, and I shook my head once, not dismissive, just precise. I am asking you to recognize what that incident exposed, I replied, and that difference mattered, because this was not about one failure, it was about the system that allowed it, and she knew it. I could see it in the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the shoreline, toward the repairs that had already been made, the work that had prevented something much worse, something they had not even fully understood at the time, and Daniel stepped in slightly then, not interrupting, but guiding, his tone measured, professional. If we proceed, he said carefully, we will need assurance that access remains stable and uninterrupted under your management. And I nodded once, because that was the part they should have asked about before, the part that mattered more than any invoice. That is exactly what the agreement guarantees, I said. Structured maintenance, scheduled inspections, documented oversight. And I could see him processing that, aligning it with the documents in his hand, because structure replaces assumption, and assumption is what got them here. And behind them another homeowner approached, this one older, quieter. Not raising his voice, just standing close enough to listen. His expression less reactive, more observant, the kind of person who understands when something fundamental is shifting, and Deborah glanced back at him briefly, then returned her focus to me, and for a moment it felt like everything narrowed down to just the three of us standing there, the gate, the water, the sound of wind and distant engines filling the spaces between words. If we sign this, she said slowly, choosing each word now, you restore access immediately and maintain full operational control moving forward. And I met her gaze, steady, because now she was saying it correctly, framing it the way it actually was. Yes. I replied, no hesitation, no extra explanation, just confirmation, and Daniel nodded once beside her. That small movement carrying more agreement than any long statement could have, because clarity simplifies decisions, even difficult ones, and Deborah looked down at the folder in his hands, then back at the gate again, where another resident had stepped away from the keypad, shaking his head, walking back toward his house with that same tight frustration I had seen building all morning, and I Could tell she was doing the math now. Not just financial, but social, reputational. The kind of cost that spreads faster than numbers on a page. And she reached out, taking the folder from Daniel, flipping it open again, slower this time, reading more carefully, not skimming, not searching for a way out, but actually absorbing it, because now she understood that missing a single line could put her right back here again. And as she turned the pages, the sound of paper moving in the breeze mixed with the quiet hum of the morning. And when she finally looked up again, there was no trace of the tone she had used in that meeting room the day before, no dismissive smile, no casual authority, just a controlled acceptance of the position she was now in. "We will sign," she said, and the words landed clean, final, not loud, not dramatic, but decisive in a way that carried weight. And Daniel gave a small nod beside her, already reaching for a pen, already shifting into execution, because once the decision is made, the rest becomes process. And I stepped forward slightly, closing the last bit of distance, the gravel crunching under my boots as I did. And for the first time since this started, the tension in the air did not feel like pressure building. It felt like something resolving, not fully, not completely, but enough to mark the point where control had changed hands. And as Deborah signed her name on that first page, the ink pressing into paper under steady pressure, I glanced past her toward the gate, still closed, still silent, waiting, because timing matters, and some things only move when everything is in place. The pen made a soft scratching sound as Deborah finished the last signature, and for a moment nobody spoke, like the entire shoreline was holding its breath waiting to see what would happen next. And I stepped forward, taking the folder back carefully, feeling the slight texture of fresh ink still settling into the paper, real, permanent, not something that could be talked away or ignored later. And Daniel watched closely as I flipped through each page, checking every line, every signature, every initial exactly where it needed to be, because details like that are what separate agreements from arguments. And when I reached the final page, I gave a small nod, not to them, but to myself, confirming that everything was now in place. And only then did I turn slightly toward the gate, reaching into my pocket for the control key, the metal cool against my fingers, solid, reliable, the same way it had always been. And I walked down the slight slope, boots crunching against gravel, each step measured, unhurried, because restoring access too quickly would have erased the weight of what had just happened. And that weight mattered. The residents had gone quiet again, watching, phones lowered now, conversations paused, because even they could feel the shift, not just in access, but in understanding. And when I reached the gate, I stopped for just a second, looking out across the water, the docks, the boats sitting idle like they had been all morning. And then I inserted the key, turned it once, slow, deliberate, and the mechanism responded immediately. A clean metallic click followed by the low hum of the lock disengaging, a sound that felt different now, heavier, earned, and the gate slid open smoothly, the same way it always had, but nothing about this moment was the same. And behind me, I heard the first engine rev, then another, movement returning in waves as people stepped forward, heading toward their boats, their docks, their routines, but with a new awareness they did not have before. And I stepped back from the gate, letting them pass, not rushing them, not stopping them, just allowing access to exist again under the terms that had just been set. And Deborah walked down slowly, stopping a few feet away from me, watching as the first boat eased into the water, her expression controlled but different, quieter, like something fundamental had shifted inside her that she could not ignore anymore. And she spoke without looking directly at me, her voice lower than it had been all day. "This will not happen again," she said. And I let a small pause settle before answering, because words like that only matter if they are grounded in something real. "No," I replied, "it will not." And Daniel joined her a moment later, adjusting his jacket slightly, already back in that composed professional posture. But even he glanced once more at the gate, at the system, at the line that had been invisible until today, and now could not be unseen, and he extended his hand again, more deliberate this time, and I shook it once, firm, acknowledging not just the agreement, but the understanding behind it. And as the noise of the lake returned, engines humming, water shifting, voices carrying across the surface again, I walked back up toward my truck, picking up the coffee I had set down hours earlier, now lukewarm but still good enough, and I took a slow sip, watching the scene settle back into something that looked normal from a distance, but was not really, because the difference between assumption and control had been drawn clear in a single morning, and lines like that do not fade easily. And as I started the engine, the familiar rumble grounding everything again, I glanced once more at the gate in the rearview mirror, standing open now, accessible, functional, exactly as it should be, but no longer taken for granted. And that was the part that mattered most, not the payment, not the signatures, but the understanding that followed. Because when people finally see where the real control sits, they move differently, they decide differently, and they remember. And as I pulled away, gravel shifting under my tires, I knew this was not just the end of a dispute. It was the start of something much quieter, much more permanent, the kind of change that does not need to be announced to be felt, because it shows up every time someone reaches for access and remembers exactly who made it possible. The lake sounded normal again, engines humming low, water cutting clean behind slow-moving boats. But normal does not mean the same, and I could feel that difference even as I drove away. The gravel road stretching out in front of me, while the rearview mirror held that gate in frame just a little longer than it used to. And by the time I reached the main road, my phone had already started buzzing, not with panic this time, but with something more controlled, more careful, the kind of communication people use when they suddenly understand there is a right way and a wrong way to approach you. And I let the first few calls go, not out of avoidance, just timing, because after a shift like that, people reveal more in what they say when they think you are not immediately available. And when I finally pulled over near the old cedar line where the signal came in stronger, I checked the screen, 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, 1 from Daniel, and a message from Deborah that was short, direct, nothing like the tone she used before. Just a confirmation that the transfer for the invoice had been initiated and a request to coordinate the first inspection under the new agreement. And I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because clarity like that is rare in situations that start with resistance. And I typed back a simple response: time, date, no extra words. Because at that point the relationship had shifted from negotiation to structure, and structure does not need explanation, it just needs execution. And as I drove back toward the property later that afternoon, the sun was higher, the light sharper, casting clean lines across the water and the houses that sat along it. And when I pulled up near the shoreline again, I noticed something immediately, small things at first, but clear. The maintenance crew already on site, not waiting, not delaying, checking dock supports, measuring angles, documenting conditions, the kind of work that should have been happening all along, but had been pushed aside until it became a problem. And I stepped out of the truck, the air warmer now, carrying that familiar mix of lake water and treated wood, and one of the crew members nodded. As I approached, not overly friendly, just respectful, aware of who was directing the process now, and I walked along the edge, checking the sections I had repaired, running my hand along the stabilized wall, feeling the difference between temporary fixes and proper reinforcement, and everything held exactly the way it should, solid, balanced, built to last. And as I moved further down, I saw Deborah standing near the far dock, speaking with Daniel again, both of them quieter than before, their movements more deliberate, less performative. And when she noticed me, she paused for just a second before walking over, not with that sharp, controlled pace from the morning, but something more measured, more grounded. "We are reviewing the long-term schedule," she said, and I nodded once, looking out across the water, because the schedule was not the point anymore. It was the consistency behind it. Make sure it is followed, I replied, and she gave a small nod in return, not arguing, not redirecting, just accepting. And that acceptance carried more weight than anything she had said the day before, because it meant she understood where the line was now. And as the afternoon moved on, the activity around the lake continued. Boats coming and going, people settling back into routines, but with a difference that sat just under the surface, a kind of awareness that access was not automatic, that it depended on something real, something maintained, something controlled. And as I finished the final inspection notes and closed the folder, the sound of water tapping lightly against the docks followed me back toward the truck, steady, consistent, the way it should be when everything is working properly. And before I got in, I glanced once more at the gate, still open, still functioning, but now part of a system that had been clearly defined. And I knew this was the part most people would miss if they only looked at the outcome. They would think it ended with a payment or a signature, but it did not. It started there, because once control is established and recognized, everything that follows either respects it or challenges it. And this time, there was no confusion left about which one it would be. The first payment cleared before sunset, and I knew it without even checking because the tone of everything around the lake had already changed, quieter, more precise, like every decision now carried a second layer of thought behind it. And when I finally opened my phone later that evening, the confirmation was there. Full amount transferred. No delays, no partials, no conditions, just a clean transaction that matched the agreement exactly. And I stood there by the edge of the property, watching the last of the lights stretch across the water, turning it into a smooth sheet of gold that hid all the work beneath it, the reinforced wall, the stabilized shoreline, the systems that most people never see but rely on every single day. And I thought about how quickly things can shift when assumptions meet reality, how something as simple as a locked gate can expose everything underneath a system that was never properly understood. And the next morning I was back on site before most of the residents had even stepped outside, the air cooler again, carrying that faint mix of damp earth and lake water. And the maintenance crew was already there, earlier than scheduled, tools laid out, checklists in hand. No hesitation, no waiting for direction, just execution. Because once structure is put in place, people either follow it or fall behind it. And no one here wanted to fall behind anymore. And as I walked along the shoreline reviewing the first full inspection under the new agreement, everything lined up exactly the way it should, documented, measured, accounted for, and for the first time since I had started working this property, it felt stable in a way that had nothing to do with the physical repairs and everything to do with clarity. And I could hear Deborah's voice in the distance, speaking with one of the crew supervisors, not directing, not correcting, just confirming details, asking questions that actually mattered. And when she noticed me, she gave a small nod, nothing exaggerated, just acknowledgement, and I returned it the same way. Because respect does not need to be announced when it is understood, and Daniel arrived shortly after, stepping out of his car with that same composed posture. But even he took a moment to look out over the lake before approaching, like he was seeing it differently now, not just as a feature on a property list, but as a system with layers, responsibilities, and limits. And we spoke briefly, nothing formal, just confirmation that everything was moving as agreed, timelines set, responsibilities clear, no gaps left for interpretation. And as the day moved forward, the rhythm of the place settled into something steady, predictable in the right way, not because nothing could go wrong, but because there was now a structure in place to handle it when it did. And that is the difference most people never think about. They assume control is about authority, about who gets to decide. But real control is about understanding where the system begins and ends, and making sure nothing falls through the space in between. And as I finished up the final checks and closed out the report for the day, the sound of the lake followed me back to my truck again, consistent, balanced, The way it should be when everything is aligned. And before I got in, I glanced once more at the gate, standing open, quiet, almost unremarkable now, but I knew exactly what it represented. Not power in the loud sense, not dominance or force, but something much more solid, something that does not need to prove itself once it is established. And as I started the engine and pulled away, gravel shifting under the tires in that familiar rhythm, I realized the simplest truth of the entire situation. They did not lose access because I locked them out. They lost access the moment they assumed it belonged to them without ever checking, and all I did was remind them where that line actually was. Because justice is not loud. It does not argue or demand attention. It just waits until everything is in place and then moves, steady, precise, and impossible to ignore once it does.